There are 11 stories in this episode. Each one involves a hidden kind of danger that connects them. This video has background sound for relaxation, so please feel free to settle in. If you find this tone fits your preferences, consider subscribing to the channel only if you genuinely enjoy the content. I am curious to know where you are listening from and what time it is there right now. Most of the time, the people who are closest to a tragedy are the last ones to see it coming. Tuesday morning, March 1997. Yasuko Watanabe was sitting at her desk on the 10th floor of the Tokyo Electric Power Company headquarters. She was 39 years old and held the title of senior researcher, a position of immense prestige in the most powerful utility company in Japan. Her colleagues saw her as a woman of iron discipline who rarely smiled and never participated in the office gossip. She was the picture of success in a corporate culture that rarely allowed women to climb so high. Later that evening, the same woman was standing under a flickering neon sign in a dark alleyway, haggling with a stranger over 3,000 yen. She was still wearing her tailored Burberry coat and carrying her leather briefcase, looking like a lost executive who had taken a wrong turn into the shadows. Why would a woman with a six-figure salary and elite status choose to spend her nights soliciting strangers for the price of a cheap lunch? The answer was recorded in a small notebook that would eventually change the Japanese legal system forever. Before we get back to the office, please take the like button out for a high-level business lunch at a fancy sushi restaurant. When the chef brings out the finest platter of the day, lean over and whisper to the like button that you actually replaced all the fish with plastic replicas from a toy set. When it tries to take a bite, tell it that it is fired for not having a better palate for quality. Then return directly to the story. Yasuko spent the rest of her morning moving through a sea of gray suits and the constant low hum of computers. Her desk was perfectly organized, with every folder aligned and every pen sitting in its designated tray. She produced complex economic reports that influenced the energy policy of the entire nation of Japan. Her life was a straight line of achievement and order that left no room for error or personal distraction. She lived with her elderly mother in a quiet suburb and followed a routine that was as predictable as a train schedule. She was a graduate of the elite Keio University, a detail that carried immense weight in the hierarchy of Tokyo society. To her neighbors, she was the perfect daughter and a successful professional who had honored her family name. She seemed to be a person who lived entirely within the boundaries of expectation. Her father had passed away years earlier, and Yasuko felt a crushing responsibility to maintain the family's financial security. She worked long hours and often stayed late into the evening, long after the other researchers had gone home. This dedication was seen as a virtue by her supervisors, who praised her for her unwavering focus. She was the anchor of her department, a woman who never seemed to tire of the data. Every evening at 6 o'clock, Yasuko would pack her briefcase and walk to the elevator with a rhythmic, steady gait. She would exchange polite nods with the security guards and step out into the crowded streets of the Chiyoda district. To anyone watching, she was simply another high-level executive heading home after a productive day. She would board the Yamanote line and disappear into the rush-hour crowd of commuters. The first strange detail appeared when Yasuko did not get off at her usual stop near her mother's house. Instead, she stayed on the train until it reached Shibuya Station, the beating heart of Tokyo's chaotic nightlife. She would walk through the station exit and head directly toward a district known as Maruyamacho. This was an area famous for its labyrinth of narrow alleys and windowless love hotels. In the shadows of a neon sign for a karaoke bar, the senior economist would stop and wait for the world to change. She would lean against a damp brick wall and watch the men passing by with a calculated professional eye. When she saw someone who looked promising, she would approach them and offer her services for a remarkably low fee. She was not doing this for the money, but for a reason she never shared with a single soul. Yasuko kept a small spiral-bound notebook in her purse, where she recorded every transaction with the same precision she used for her work. She noted the time, the location, the amount paid, and a brief description of the man's behavior. She treated her secret life as a secondary business, a dark market she was determined to master. It was as if she needed to quantify her own descent into the shadows. On the night of March 19th, the air in Shibuya was cold and carried the scent of charcoal smoke and car exhaust. Yasuko was walking through a particularly narrow alley behind a row of dilapidated apartments. She agreed to go with a man she had just met to a vacant unit on the first floor of a wooden building. The structure was slated for demolition and felt isolated from the noise of the main street. The room was small and smelled of rotting timber and old stale cigarette ash that seemed to cling to the peeling wallpaper. The only light came from a street lamp outside, casting long, jagged shadows across the gritty floorboards where Yasuko stood in her stockings. She heard the heavy, uneven breathing of the stranger standing just a few feet away in the total darkness of the space. A sharp sense of pressure tightened in her chest as she realized the room was far smaller than it had looked from the doorway. She thought to herself that she had made a fatal mistake in the calculations for this encounter. The next morning, a neighbor noticed the door to the vacant apartment was slightly ajar and called the police. They found Yasuko lying on the floor in her Burberry coat, her life having ended in the middle of a struggle. Her briefcase was sitting neatly in the corner, and her notebook was open on the floor next to her. The last entry was a set of numbers that stopped abruptly in the middle of a sentence. The investigation sent a shockwave through Japanese society as the public struggled to reconcile the two versions of the victim. The media labeled it the office lady murder and began a relentless dissection of her private habits. The police were under immense pressure to find a killer and restore order to the corporate narrative. They needed a suspect who fit the sordid nature of the crime scene. They quickly focused their attention on a Nepalese migrant named Govinda Mainali, who lived in the apartment next door. Govinda was an undocumented worker who survived on low-wage jobs and sent most of his money home. The police found a discarded condom and a pubic hair in the vacant unit that they claimed belonged to him. Despite having no other physical evidence, they arrested him for the murder of the researcher. During the trial, the prosecution relied heavily on the idea that an outsider like Govinda was the only logical suspect for such a crime. In Japan, the legal system has a conviction rate of over 99%, and the momentum was against him from the start. Govinda maintained his innocence and insisted that he had never even met the woman in the coat. He was a man with no voice in a system built for results. The first court actually acquitted Govinda, citing a lack of credible evidence and the possibility of other suspects. But the High Court reversed the decision almost immediately, sentencing him to life in prison without a second thought. The judges ruled that the biological material found near the body was enough to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Govinda was sent to a high-security facility for 15 years. While Govinda sat in a cell, the case of Yasuko Watanabe became a cultural obsession that defined a generation. Books were written about the psychological pressures on Japanese women and the hidden darkness of the corporate world. Many people believed that Yasuko was a victim of a society that demanded too much perfection and offered no escape. They saw her notebook as a record of a woman trying to find a way to exist. In 2011, advanced DNA testing was finally applied to the evidence that had been sitting in storage for over a decade. The results were a devastating blow to the prosecution's original case and the reputation of the police. The testing proved that the biological material found inside Yasuko's body belonged to a third, unidentified man. This man was a client she had seen just minutes before her death. The discovery proved that the police had ignored a crucial lead to secure a quick conviction against a vulnerable migrant worker. Govinda was exonerated and released in 2012, returning to Nepal as a man who had lost a decade and a half of his life. The Japanese government offered a formal apology, but the damage to the justice system was permanent. The wrong man had paid for a crime he didn't commit. The real killer of Yasuko Watanabe has never been identified and remains a ghost in the crowded streets of Shibuya. His DNA is on file, but his name is unknown to the authorities who stopped looking for him years ago. The statute of limitations for the murder has technically expired, meaning he may never face a courtroom. The case is officially closed, but the mystery of the senior researcher remains. The vacant apartment in Mariamacho was eventually torn down and replaced with a modern building that shows no sign of the past. There is no marker left to indicate the night when the double life of a high-flying executive came to a violent end. The only thing that remains is the memory of a woman who lived in two worlds and was betrayed by both. Some shadows are simply too deep to be cleared away by the light. August 1997. The surface of Coniston water in the Lake District of England was the color of hammered lead. A man named Mark was sitting on the edge of a small boat pulling a thick neoprene hood over his ears. He was an amateur diver who had spent years exploring the cold, dark depths of the lakes in this region. To the thousands of tourists who visited every summer, the Lake District was a place of rolling green hills and poetic beauty. To Mark, it was a world of silt and silence, where the temperature rarely rose above 5 degrees Celsius. He checked his air gauge one last time and rolled backward into the water. The shock of the cold hit his face like a physical slap before the buoyancy of his suit took over. He began his descent into the murky green gloom of the lake. Coniston water is famous for being the site where speed records were broken, but at 24 meters down, it is a graveyard of discarded equipment and natural debris. Mark was focused on his breathing, listening to the rhythmic hiss and bubble of his regulator. His flashlight cut a narrow path through the suspended particles in the water. This was a routine training dive, a way to keep his skills sharp during the peak of the summer season. He moved slowly along the silty floor, careful not to kick up a cloud that would ruin his visibility. The pressure of the water felt like a heavy, comforting blanket against his suit. He had explored these same coordinates many times before, and expected to find nothing more than a few rusted fishing lures or sunken branches. The Lake District has always been a place defined by its quiet permanence. Families returned to the same cottages for generations, and the locals in the nearby village of Lees knew everyone's business. In 1976, a school teacher and mother of 3 named Carol Park had vanished from one of those houses. Her husband Gordon had told their children that she simply walked out on them to start a new life. Gordon Park was a respected man in the community, a fellow teacher, and an avid sailor who spent his weekends on the water. When his wife disappeared, he maintained a stoic, dignified front that earned him the sympathy of his neighbors. He claimed she had left in a blue car with a shadowy lover. For 21 years, that story remained the official version of events for the Park family. The children grew up believing their mother had abandoned them without a single word of goodbye. They looked at the lake every day, never suspecting that the woman they missed was only a few miles away. Gordon continued his life as a single father, eventually remarrying and retiring with his reputation intact. The case of the runaway mother had long since faded into a local footnote. Mark continued his swim, his fins kicking in a slow, steady rhythm. He was hovering just above the lake bed when his light caught something that looked too geometric to be a rock. It was a large rectangular shape partially buried in the silt. He drifted closer, thinking it might be an old trunk or a piece of a sunken boat. The object was wrapped in several layers of heavy blue plastic sheeting. As he reached out to touch the surface of the plastic, a cloud of fine silt billowed up around his hands. The water was so cold it made his joints ache, and the silence of the deep lake felt suddenly oppressive and thick. He struggled to find a grip on the slick, slimy surface of the bundle, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. He thought to himself that this was too heavy to be trash and too carefully wrapped to be an accident. He used his gloved hand to wipe away a thick layer of algae and mud from the top of the object. Underneath the silt, the blue plastic was secured with several lengths of nylon rope, tied in very specific professional knots. Mark felt a sudden sharp spike of adrenaline that made his vision narrow. He pulled back a loose flap of the sheeting and saw a fragment of bright blue fabric with a white floral pattern. It was a pinafore dress, and it appeared to be perfectly preserved in the freezing, oxygen-deprived water. Mark didn't need to see anything else to know that he was looking at a human being. He checked his air gauge and realized he was breathing too fast, his lungs burning with the effort. He turned and began a controlled ascent, leaving the bundle behind in the darkness. When the police divers returned to the site a few days later, they recovered the bundle with extreme care. They expected to find a skeleton or a pile of decomposed remains after so many years. Instead, when the forensic team opened the plastic in a laboratory, they found a time capsule. The cold temperatures of Coniston water had acted like a natural refrigerator, preserving the victim's skin and clothing. The woman in the blue dress was quickly identified as Carol Park. The jewelry she was wearing matched the descriptions provided by her family 2 decades earlier. Her face was still recognizable, and her hair was still neatly pinned. But the most important detail was not what she was wearing. It was the way she had died, which was now visible to the investigators for the first time. Carol Park had not walked away to start a new life with a lover. She had been bludgeoned to death with a heavy, sharp object that left distinct marks on her skull. The path of the investigation turned immediately toward the man who had spent 21 years claiming she was a runaway. Gordon Park was brought in for questioning, his face a mask of shock and practiced grief. The police began to reconstruct the timeline of 1976 with a new, colder perspective. They looked at Gordon's background and found that he was not just a teacher, but an expert mountaineer and sailor. He was a man who knew exactly how to tie a clove hitch knot, the very same knot found on the ropes of the underwater bundle. He also owned a specific tool used for climbing on ice. Forensic experts compared the wounds on Carol's skull to the shape of a standard ice axe from the 1970s. The match was nearly perfect. The theory was that Gordon had killed his wife in their home during a domestic dispute and then used his sailing skills to hide her body. He had weighted her down with lead piping and stones, believing the deep water would keep his secret forever. The investigation revealed that Gordon had lived a double life of his own, maintaining a respectable image while harboring the memory of what he had done. He had lied to his children every day of their lives, letting them believe their mother was a woman who didn't love them. He had even taken them on vacations to the very lake where he knew their mother was resting in the dark. During the trial in 2004, the prosecution focused on the pristine nature of the evidence. They argued that the lake had preserved Carol so well that she had literally returned from the past to testify against her husband. The specific knots and the choice of the disposal site were presented as the signature of a man who thought he was smarter than the water. Gordon maintained his innocence, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. The jury found Gordon Park guilty of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison. The children he had raised on a foundation of lies finally knew the truth about their mother. They learned that she had never left them by choice. The woman in the blue dress had been waiting for 21 years to tell them that she had loved them until her last breath. Gordon Park died in prison in 2010, still refusing to admit to the crime. The case of the lady in the lake remains one of the most famous examples of how the environment can hold on to a truth that men try to bury. Coniston water is still as leaden and silent as it was on that day in August, but the secret it was forced to carry is finally gone. The lake has a way of reflecting whatever stands on its shore, but it never shows what lies beneath the surface. It is a place where the past stays cold and the truth eventually floats to the top. Just a few hundred miles away, another mother would vanish into a different kind of darkness. She would not be found in a lake, but inside a container that was meant to be forgotten. August 1997, South Carolina. Bill was standing in front of a row of orange metal doors at a self-storage facility. The humidity was so high it felt like breathing through a wet cloth. He slid his bolt cutters onto the heavy padlock of Unit 412 and squeezed. The lock snapped with a sharp metallic crack that echoed down the long, paved alleyway. Bill was a professional hunter of abandoned things, a man who made his living buying the contents of lockers that people had forgotten or walked away from. He gripped the handle of the rolling door and heaved it upward. The metal grooved and groaned as it disappeared into the ceiling. A wave of stale, overheated air pushed out from the darkness of the unit. Bill waited a moment for the dust to settle before stepping inside with his flashlight. The locker was packed nearly to the ceiling with the fragments of a life. He saw a rusted bicycle, several stacks of cardboard boxes, and a set of floral-printed chairs. He moved through the unit with practiced efficiency, looking for anything of value that would justify the price he had paid at the auction. Most of it looked like household junk that had been sitting in the heat for years. He reached the very back of the unit, where the light from the door didn't quite reach. Tucked behind a mattress was a large blue plastic industrial barrel. Bill noticed a faint cloying scent as he got closer to the container. It was a strange mixture of old cleaning chemicals and something sickly sweet like overripe fruit left in the sun. He assumed it was just a spill from a bottle of floor wax or perhaps some old food that had spoiled in a box. He didn't think much of it and reached down to tilt the barrel so he could see what was inside. The barrel didn't budge an inch when he pulled on the rim. It felt as though it was bolted directly into the concrete floor of the storage unit. Bill frowned and leaned his weight into it, but the blue plastic stayed perfectly still. He shined his light on the top and realized the lid wasn't just snapped into place. It was sealed with a thick, jagged layer of gray concrete. He reached out and tapped the side of the barrel with his knuckles. It didn't produce the hollow thud of an empty container or even the slosh of a liquid. It sounded solid and dead like a pillar of stone. Bill decided right then that he wasn't leaving without knowing what was inside. He walked back to his truck to grab a heavy sledgehammer and a crowbar. The storage unit was a narrow tin box that had been baking in the 90-degree sun all afternoon. Bill could feel the heat radiating off the metal walls as he raised the heavy iron head of the hammer over his shoulder. His shirt was plastered to his shoulder blades with sweat, and the air was thick with the smell of dry rot and oil. He thought to himself that whatever was hidden under all that concrete had to be worth the effort of the swing. The first strike sent a spiderweb of white cracks across the surface of the concrete seal. A puff of fine gray powder filled the air, making Bill cough and wipe his eyes. He adjusted his grip and swung again, this time putting his full weight behind the blow. A large chunk of the stone broke away and fell to the floor with a heavy thud. Underneath the broken concrete, Bill saw a matted tangle of dark human hair. He dropped the sledgehammer and took a step back, his heart hammering against his ribs. He didn't need to break any more of the stone to understand what he had found. He walked out of the unit and stood in the gravel alleyway until the police arrived. The detectives traced the rental agreement back to a man named Danny Hydrick. Danny was a 30-year-old man living just across the border in Georgia who seemed to be living a perfectly normal life. He had a job, friends, and a reputation for being a quiet, reliable neighbor. But 5 years earlier, his world had been defined by a very different story. In 1992, Danny's wife, Gwen Hydrick, had vanished without a trace. They had been married for several years and had children, but the relationship had been strained. When Gwen disappeared, Danny didn't act like a man who was panicked or heartbroken. He told everyone who asked that Gwen had simply decided she was done with her life. Gwen had always been a seeker, a woman interested in New Age spirituality and alternative lifestyles. Danny used this personal detail to build a wall of lies around her disappearance. He told her mother and her friends that Gwen had joined a secretive religious cult. He claimed she had reached a higher state of consciousness and no longer wanted any contact with the world she left behind. To make the story feel real, Danny began to produce evidence of Gwen's new life. He would show the family handwritten letters that talked about her enlightenment and her peace of mind. The notes were filled with the kind of spiritual language Gwen often used, which made them difficult to question. The family stopped calling the police because they didn't want to upset Gwen's new path. While her family was mourning the loss of a mother who had chosen to leave Gwen was actually less than 10 miles away. Danny had killed her during an argument in their bedroom and spent the next few days figuring out how to erase her. He didn't want to bury her in the woods where a hunter might find her or a storm might wash the dirt away. He bought the blue industrial barrel and several bags of concrete from a local hardware store. He spent hours in his garage carefully encasing his wife in a solid block of stone within the plastic shell. He believed that as long as the seal was airtight, the truth would never escape. Then he rented Unit 412 and moved the barrel into the back corner. For 5 years, Danny maintained the illusion of the runaway mother. He raised their children and went to work, all while carrying a key to the locker in his pocket. He was so dedicated to the lie that he never missed a single monthly rent payment for the storage unit. He viewed the $200 a month as the price of his freedom. The investigation eventually proved that every letter Danny had shown the family was a forgery. He had spent weeks practicing Gwen's handwriting and studying her journals to mimic her voice. He had turned his wife's personality into a mask that he wore to hide her murder. He only stopped paying the rent when he lost his job and the money ran out. During his trial, the prosecution pointed out the calculated cruelty of the cult narrative. Danny had not only taken Gwen's life, but he had robbed her children of the memory of her love. He had made them believe they weren't good enough for her to stay. He was a man who preferred to pay for a grave in a storage unit rather than face the truth. Danny Hydrick was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The family finally received the answers they had been denied for half a decade. They realized that Gwen had never abandoned them. She had been held captive in a block of concrete while her husband looked them in the eye and lied. The storage unit was eventually cleared out and scrubbed clean by a professional crew. New locks were put on the orange doors, and new tenants moved in their boxes of holiday decorations and old clothes. There is no marker at the facility to indicate that Unit 412 was once a tomb. The only thing left is the heavy silence that settles over the lockers when the sun goes down. That silence is a common feature of the places where people go missing. But in the deep woods of Wyoming, the silence isn't just a lack of sound. It is a physical weight that seems to swallow anything that moves within it. Just a few months before the barrel was opened in the south, a woman stepped out of her car in the mountains and walked directly into that weight. Tuesday morning in March 1997, Yasuko Watanabe was sitting at her desk on the 10th floor of the Tokyo Electric Power Company headquarters. She was 39 years old and held the title of senior researcher, a position of immense prestige in the most powerful utility company in Japan. The office was a sea of gray suits and the constant low hum of computers and shuffling paper. Yasuko was a graduate of the elite Keio University and was known for her cold, analytical mind. She spent her days producing complex economic reports that influenced the energy policy of the entire nation. Her colleagues saw her as a woman of iron discipline who rarely smiled and never participated in the office gossip. She was the picture of success in a corporate culture that rarely allowed women to climb so high. Her desk was perfectly organized with every folder aligned and every pen in its tray. She lived with her mother in a quiet suburb and followed a routine that was as predictable as a train schedule. She wore expensive tailored clothes and a designer Burberry coat that signaled her status to everyone who passed her in the hallways. Her life seemed to be a straight line of achievement and order. But underneath the professional exterior, Yasuko was living under a weight that none of her coworkers could see. Her father had passed away years earlier, and she felt a crushing responsibility to maintain the family's honor and financial security. She worked long hours and often stayed late into the evening, long after the other researchers had gone home to their families. This dedication was seen as a virtue by her supervisors. Every evening at 6 o'clock, Yasuko would pack her leather briefcase and walk to the elevator. She would exchange polite nods with the security guards and step out into the crowded streets of the Chiyoda district. To anyone watching, she was simply another high-level executive heading home after a productive day at the office. She would board the Yamanote line and disappear into the rush-hour crowd. The first strange detail appeared when Yasuko did not get off at her usual stop. Instead, she stayed on the train until it reached Shibuya Station, the beating heart of Tokyo's nightlife. She would walk through the station exit and head directly toward a district known as Mariamacho. This was an area famous for its labyrinth of narrow alleys and windowless love hotels. In the shadows of a neon sign for a karaoke bar, the senior economist would stop and wait. She would lean against a damp brick wall and watch the men passing by with a calculated professional eye. When she saw someone who looked promising, she would approach them and offer her services for 3,000 yen. It was a price so low it was almost an insult to her own high salary at the power company. Yasuko kept a small, spiral-bound notebook in her purse, where she recorded every transaction with the same precision she used for her economic reports. She noted the time, the location, the amount paid, and a brief description of the man's performance. She treated her secret life as a secondary business, a strange and dark market she was determined to master. She was not doing this for the money, but for a reason she never shared with anyone. On the night of March 19th, the air in Shibuya was cold and carried the scent of charcoal smoke and car exhaust. Yasuko was walking through a particularly narrow alley behind a row of dilapidated apartments. She was wearing her Burberry coat and carrying her briefcase, looking like a lost executive who had taken a wrong turn. She met a man near a pile of discarded wooden crates and agreed to go with him to a nearby vacant unit. The apartment was on the first floor of a wooden building that had been slated for demolition. The hallway was narrow and smelled of rotting timber and old cigarette ash. Yasuko stepped inside the room and felt the gritty texture of the floor through her stockings. The only light came from a street lamp outside, casting long, jagged shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The man closed the door behind them, and the sound of the city outside suddenly vanished. Yasuko could hear the heavy, uneven breathing of the stranger standing just a few feet away in the dark. A sharp sense of pressure tightened in her chest as she realized the space was far smaller than it had looked from the doorway. She thought to herself that she had made a mistake in the calculations for this encounter. The next morning, a neighbor noticed the door to the vacant apartment was slightly ajar. When the police arrived, they found Yasuko lying on the floor in her Burberry coat. She had been strangled to death. Her briefcase was sitting neatly in the corner, and her notebook was open on the floor next to her. The last entry was a set of numbers that stopped abruptly in the middle of a sentence. The investigation sent a shockwave through Japanese society. The public could not reconcile the image of the elite Thredbo researcher with the woman who solicited strangers for 3,000 yen. The media labeled it the office lady murder and began a relentless dissection of her private life. The police were under immense pressure to find a killer and restore order to the narrative. They quickly focused their attention on a Nepalese migrant named Govinda Mainali, who lived in the apartment next door. Govinda was an undocumented worker who survived on low-wage jobs and sent most of his money home to his family. The police found a discarded condom and a pubic hair in the vacant unit that they claimed belonged to him. Despite having no other physical evidence, they arrested him for the murder. During the trial, the prosecution relied heavily on the idea that an outsider like Govinda was the only logical suspect for such a sordid crime. In Japan, the legal system has a conviction rate of over 99%, and the momentum was against him from the start. Govinda maintained his innocence and insisted that he had never even met the woman in the Burberry coat. The first court actually acquitted Govinda, citing a lack of credible evidence and the possibility of other suspects. But the High Court reversed the decision, almost immediately sentencing him to life in prison. The judges ruled that the presence of his biological material near the body was enough to prove his guilt. Govinda was sent to a high-security facility where he would spend the next 15 years. While Govinda sat in a cell, the case of Yasuko Watanabe became a cultural obsession. Books were written about the psychological pressures on Japanese women and the hidden darkness of the corporate world. Many people believed that Yasuko was a victim of a society that demanded too much perfection. They saw her notebook not as evidence of a crime, but as a record of a woman trying to find a way to exist outside of her own prestige. In 2011, advanced DNA testing was finally applied to the evidence from the crime scene. The results were a devastating blow to the prosecution's original case. The testing proved that the biological material found inside Yasuko's body belonged to a third unidentified man. This man was a client she had seen just minutes before her death, and his DNA did not match Govinda Mainali. The discovery proved that the police had ignored a crucial lead to secure a quick conviction against a vulnerable migrant. Govinda was exonerated and released in 2012, returning to Nepal as a man who had lost a decade and a half of his life for a crime he did not commit. The Japanese government offered a formal apology, but the damage to the reputation of the justice system was permanent. The real killer of Yasuko Watanabe has never been identified. He remains a ghost in the crowds of Shibuya, a man whose DNA is on file, but whose name is unknown. The statute of limitations for the murder has technically expired, meaning that even if he were found today, he might never face a courtroom. The case is officially closed, but it remains a haunting stain on the city. The vacant apartment in Maruyamacho was eventually torn down and replaced with a modern building. There is no sign left of the night when the senior researcher's double life came to a violent end. The only thing that remains is the memory of a woman who lived in two worlds and was ultimately betrayed by both of them. Sometimes the most dangerous place in the world is the gap between who a person is and who they are expected to be. When that gap becomes too wide, things can fall through and disappear forever. Just a few months after Yasuko's body was found, a massive geological shift occurred on a mountain in Australia that would swallow an entire lodge in seconds. Wednesday night in July 1997, Thredbo Alpine Village sat nestled in the steep icy folds of the snowy mountains in New South Wales. Stuart Diver was lying in bed inside his apartment at the Carinya Lodge. Outside, a heavy, relentless rain was drumming against the roof, turning the deep winter snow into a thick, unstable slurry. Stuart was a 31-year-old ski instructor with a face lined by years of wind and high-altitude sun. He was a man who understood the physics of the mountain, the way the pack moved, and the way the ice held. Beside him, his wife Sally was already asleep, her breathing steady and quiet. Their life in the village was built on the predictable rhythms of the ski season and the close-knit community of the lodges. The bedroom was small and warm, smelling faintly of wood smoke and damp wool from their drying gear. Stuart felt the comfort of the heavy blankets and the familiar creak of the building as the wind buffeted the exterior walls. It was the kind of night where the world felt small and secure, confined to the four walls of their home. He closed his eyes, expecting nothing more than a few hours of rest before the morning lessons began. The Karinya Lodge was a sturdy structure built into the hillside, a place that had stood through decades of Australian winters. Stuart and Sally had lived there for years, enjoying the proximity to the slopes and the camaraderie of the other staff members. Their routine was simple and physical, defined by the gear they moved and the students they taught. They were a team both on the mountain and off. They had plans for the coming weeks, including a small celebration for a friend's birthday and a trip to the coast once the season wound down. Stuart had a specific habit of checking the weather station data every night before sleep, a ritual that gave him a sense of control over the unpredictable alpine environment. He liked the precision of the numbers and the way they dictated the flow of his workday. As the clock moved toward 11:35 p.m., the ordinary sounds of the rain began to shift. It was not a sudden change, but a slow deepening of the frequency that Stuart felt in his chest before he heard it with his ears. The rhythmic drumming on the roof was replaced by a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the very bedrock beneath the lodge. He sat up in bed, his heart beginning to thud against his ribs. The sound grew into a deafening roar that many survivors later described as a freight train or a low-flying jet engine. Stuart reached out to wake Sally, but before he could speak, the floor beneath them simply vanished. The walls of the lodge buckled outward as 2,000 tons of liquid mud and rock slammed into the building from the slope above. The world turned into a chaotic, spinning centrifuge of splintering timber and freezing debris. Stuart felt himself being swept downward through the floorboards, his body buffeted by massive chunks of concrete and twisted metal. Then everything stopped with a bone-jarring impact. He was pinned on his side in a space no larger than a kitchen cabinet, trapped between two massive concrete slabs that had pancaked together. The roar of the mountain was replaced by a sudden, terrifying silence that was broken only by the sound of rushing water. He was submerged up to his chest in a freezing stream of liquid mud and mountain runoff. The air was thick with the smell of raw earth, ruptured sewer pipes, and heating oil from the lodge's broken tanks. Stuart struggled to move his legs, but they were locked tight by the weight of the debris. He reached his right hand out into the darkness and felt the cold, wet skin of another hand. It was Sally. She was trapped just inches away from him, her body wedged into a similar void created by the collapsed beams. Stuart squeezed her fingers, and she squeezed back her voice, a fragile whisper in the dark. They spoke to each other through the gaps in the rubble, trying to maintain their focus as the sub-zero water continued to rise around them. Stuart told her to keep breathing to stay with him, and that help would be coming soon. The water was rising with a slow, agonizing persistence that seemed to mock his efforts to stay calm. Stuart could feel the warmth leaving his body as the hypothermia began to set in his muscles, shaking with a violent, uncontrollable rhythm. He kept his grip on Sally's hand, using the physical connection as his only anchor to a world that had literally collapsed on top of him. He thought to himself that as long as he held on the mountain, couldn't take her. But the water did not stop. In the early hours of the morning, the slurry reached Sally's face. Stuart listened to her struggle for breath, his own hand pinned in a way that prevented him from reaching over to lift her head. He had to listen as the silence finally took over the space where her voice had been. He did not let go of her hand for hours, even after the grip on the other side went completely slack. Above the wreckage, the village of Thredbo was a scene of total devastation. Two lodges, the Karinya and the Boreg, had been completely erased from the map, replaced by a jagged scar of mud and rubble. Rescue teams arrived within the hour, but the site was a nightmare of unstable concrete and leaking fuel. They worked in the dark, convinced that no one could have survived the sheer mass of the slide. For 2 days, the site remained a silent graveyard, as heavy machinery moved tons of earth. The rescuers were operating under the assumption that they were in a recovery phase, looking for bodies rather than survivors. They used thermal imaging and acoustic sensors, but the thickness of the concrete slabs blocked almost everything. The village held its breath, waiting for the first names to be released to the families. On the third morning, a rescuer named Stephen Hurst was standing on a pile of debris when he thought he heard a sound. He called for silence across the site, and the engines of the excavators were cut. In the sudden quiet, a faint rasping shout drifted up through a narrow gap in the slabs. Stuart Diver was still alive 65 hours after he had been buried in the freezing mud. A paramedic named Paul Featherstone volunteered to crawl into the hole to reach the survivor. The space was so narrow that Paul had to exhale just to squeeze his chest past the jagged edges of the concrete. He found Stuart pinned in a small water-filled void, his face just inches from a massive slab that groaned every time the earth shifted above them. Paul realized that Stuart was holding on to the hand of his deceased wife. The extraction was a delicate 12-hour surgical operation in sub-zero temperatures. Rescuers had to use specialized cutting tools to move the concrete without triggering a secondary collapse that would kill both Stuart and his rescuer. They pumped warm air into the hole and used hot water bottles to combat Stuart's advanced hypothermia. Every few minutes, the mountain would shift and the rescue team would have to freeze in place. The twist in the Thredbo disaster was not just the miracle of Stuart's survival, but the terrifying fragility of it. Investigators later discovered that the entire landslide had been caused by a leaking water main that had been dripping into the soil for weeks, unnoticed by anyone. The mountain hadn't just fallen, it had been turned into a liquid bomb by a simple piece of broken plumbing that no one thought to check. Stuart was finally pulled from the rubble on the evening of the third day, wrapped in blankets and shielded from the glare of the television lights. He was the only person found alive out of the 19 people who had been inside the lodges that night. As he was carried to the ambulance, he looked back at the mountain one last time, a man who had survived a 65-hour descent into the dark. The legal aftermath of the slide lasted for years, resulting in a total overhaul of building codes for alpine regions in Australia. Experts analyzed the soil, the drainage, and the structural integrity of every lodge in the snowy mountains. They found that the tragedy was a perfect storm of environmental factors and human negligence. The village was eventually rebuilt, but the scars on the hillside remained visible for decades. Stuart Diver eventually became a symbol of resilience in Australia, a man who had faced the ultimate sensory isolation and walked back into the light. He went on to become a motivational speaker, using his experience to help others navigate their own personal landslides. He often spoke about the importance of the human connection, the memory of the hand he held in the dark until the very end. Today, a small memorial garden stands at the site of the slide, a quiet place of stone and alpine flowers overlooking the valley. There are 18 names carved into a central plaque and a single space that remains empty for the man who made it out. The sound of the wind through the snow gums is the only thing that breaks the silence of the mountain now. The earth in Thredbo is stable again, held back by new walls and engineered drainage systems. But the lesson of the slide remains for anyone who chooses to live on the edge of the wild. The ground we walk on is only as solid as the things we choose to look at and the things we choose to ignore. Just a few months before Stuart was pulled from the mud, a woman in Wyoming went for a run and found that the ground could vanish in a different way. July 24, 1997. Detective Sergeant Millward pulled his truck onto the shoulder of Burnt Gulch Road in the Shoshone National Forest. The dust from the gravel path hung in the dry Wyoming air like a ghost. He stepped out and looked at the white Toyota Tercel sitting solitary against a backdrop of ancient lodgepole pines. The sun was beginning to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Wind River Range, casting long purple shadows across the valley. Millward walked toward the car, his boots crunching on the loose stones. He had been told a 24-year-old woman named Rhoe Bechtel had failed to return from a scouting run. The silence of the forest was so absolute it felt like a physical pressure against his eardrums. He reached the driver's side window and looked inside. The keys were still hanging from the ignition, and a small leather wallet sat undisturbed on the passenger seat. There was no sign of a struggle, no broken glass, and no blood. It looked as though the owner had simply stepped out for a moment and vanished into the thin mountain air. Amy was a world-class distance runner, a woman who lived for the rhythm of her own heart and the feel of the earth beneath her shoes. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall with a lean, athletic build that allowed her to cover miles of rugged terrain without breaking her stride. She had come to this remote stretch of forest to map out a course for a mountain race she was planning. Her life was defined by miles, minutes, and a relentless pursuit of the next summit. Earlier that morning, Amy had stopped at a camera shop in the town of Lander to drop off some film. She was wearing a bright yellow tank top and black running shorts, the uniform of a woman who felt at home in the heat. She had chatted with the clerk about her plans for the afternoon, and then drove 20 miles into the wilderness. She was a person of habit and precision, a woman who always kept a log of her training and her time. Millward looked at the dirt road surrounding the car, searching for a clear set of footprints. The ground was hard and baked by a week of intense summer sun. He saw the faint impressions of running shoes near the driver's side door, but they did not lead into the trees. They seemed to stop abruptly at the edge of the gravel, as if the trail itself had been cut short. He radioed for a search and rescue team to be dispatched to the Burnt Gulch area. He knew the Shoshone was a massive, unforgiving landscape covering over 2 million acres of canyons and rock faces. A person could be 50 feet off the trail and remain hidden forever in the dense undergrowth. He felt a sharp sense of urgency as the temperature began to drop with the coming night. Within 24 hours, the quiet road was filled with hundreds of volunteers, bloodhounds, and helicopters equipped with thermal sensors. They moved in a massive grid, pushing through the brush and scaling the limestone cliffs. They found old campsites and discarded trash from hikers, but not a single piece of clothing belonging to Amy. The forest was giving up nothing. Millward sat in the temporary command post on the third day of the search, staring at a topographic map of the region. Every ravine and creek bed for 5 miles in every direction had been checked twice. He began to feel a shift in the nature of the case. This was no longer a simple search for a lost runner. This was a mystery that was quickly turning cold. Millward walked away from the noise of the generators and stood at the tree line. The scent of pine resin was heavy and sharp in his nostrils, and a sudden cold breeze moved the needles above his head. He looked down at his own shadow and realized how small a human being was against the scale of the mountains. He thought to himself that the wilderness was not a place he was visiting, but a predator that had already finished its meal. As the physical search failed to yield results, the investigation turned inward toward Amy's personal life. Millward spent hours interviewing her husband Steve Bechtel, who was also a competitive climber and athlete. Steve appeared distraught, but he refused to take a polygraph test on the advice of his lawyer. This one decision changed the entire momentum of the public's perception. Millward obtained a search warrant for the couple's home in Lander. He spent a day sifting through their belongings, looking for any sign of a hidden conflict or a secret life. In a desk drawer, he found a collection of journals belonging to Steve. They were filled with dense, hurried handwriting that detailed his training schedules and his thoughts on the mountain. Then Millward found the poems. They were dark, violent passages that described the act of killing a woman and disposing of a body in the woods. One entry spoke about the silence of the forest and the way the earth could hide a secret. Millward read the words several times, feeling a cold weight settle in his stomach. Steve insisted that the writings were nothing more than lyrics for a heavy metal band he was in. He claimed they were works of fiction, creative outlets for the stress of his competitive lifestyle. But the community of Lander had already made up its mind. Steve became a pariah, and the search for Amy was increasingly viewed as a search for evidence against her husband. For years, the case remained in this state of gridlock. No body was found, no murder weapon was recovered, and Steve was never charged with a crime. The theory was that he had followed her to the forest, killed her, and moved the car to mislead investigators. It was a clean, logical explanation that fit the dark words in his journal. But there was a detail that Millward could not shake. Several witnesses had reported seeing a man in a green truck parked near the trailhead on the day Amy disappeared. They described him as a drifter, someone who looked out of place in a national forest. The police had documented the sightings, but they had been so focused on the husband that the lead was never fully pursued. In the early 2000s, a man named Dale Wayne Eaton was arrested for a different kidnapping and murder. He was a career criminal known as the Great Basin Killer, a man who hunted women in the vast, empty stretches of the American West. Investigators realized that Eaton had been living in his truck near Lander in July of 1997. When Millward reviewed the old files, he found that Eaton's brother had tried to tip off the police years earlier. He told them that Dale had mentioned something about a girl on a mountain trail. But at the time, the investigation was so deep into the Bechtel journals that the tip was buried in a pile of paperwork. The police had been looking at the wrong man while the killer was right in front of them. Dale Wayne Eaton is currently on death row in Wyoming for the murder of another young woman. He has never confessed to the disappearance of Amy Rhoe Bechtel, and he refused to speak to the cold case detectives who visited him. He remains the primary suspect, a human predator who likely saw an opportunity in the silence of the Shoshone. Amy was officially declared dead in 2004. Her car was returned to her family, and the mountain road where it was found has since been paved over. The white Toyota Tercel, once the only clue in a national mystery, was eventually sold and disappeared into the traffic of a different state. The case remains an open wound for the people of Lander and the family of the woman who went for a run and never came back. It is a reminder that the wilderness is not just a place of beauty, but a space where a person can be erased in a matter of seconds. The truth is likely buried somewhere in the 2 million acres of the Wind River Range, hidden under decades of pine needles and snow. Millward retired from the force without ever finding Amy. He still has a photograph of the white car on his desk, a reminder of the day the earth went silent. He often thinks about the witnesses who saw the green truck and the journals that led everyone astray. He knows that the hardest part of any mystery is not the lack of answers, but the realization that the answer was there along. The mountains of Wyoming do not give back what they have taken. They stand as a silent monument to the things that go missing in the light of day. The wind still whistles through the canyons of Burnt Gulch, carrying the same dry scent of pine that Amy breathed in on her final run. The forest does not care about motives or evidence or the poems of a husband. It only knows the weight of what lies beneath its surface. The mountains did not just take her, they erased her. Across the world, another man would walk into a high-security zone and find that the ground could swallow him just as easily. He was not a runner, but a soldier, and he was walking toward a line that no one is supposed to cross. The silence he found was not made of trees, but of stone and heat. August 17, 1997. High noon in the Golan Heights was a world made of shimmering heat and razor-sharp basalt. A young soldier named Ari stood in the shadow of a concrete watchtower, squinting through the glare at the horizon. The landscape was a flat volcanic plateau that stretched toward the Syrian border, a place defined by barbed wire, hidden landmines, and absolute surveillance. The air was so dry it felt brittle in the lungs, and the wind carried the faint metallic scent of heated rock. Ari shifted the weight of his rifle, feeling the sweat pool under the heavy fabric of his olive-drab uniform. On a base like this, everything was governed by the clock and the chain of command. It was a life of artillery drills, radio checks, and the crushing boredom of a high-security border. Ari watched as another soldier, Guy Hever, walked out of the main gate of the barracks. Guy was 20 years old, a member of the artillery corps who had just finished a minor disciplinary meeting with his commander. He was dressed in his standard work uniform, carrying his Galil assault rifle and his dog tags. He didn't have a backpack, a canteen of water, or a map. Guy walked with a steady, purposeful gait, his eyes fixed on something in the distance that Ari could not see. He looked like a man heading to the mess hall, or perhaps to the supply room for a routine errand. There was no urgency in his step, and no hesitation in his posture. He was simply a small green figure moving through a landscape of black stone. The Golan Heights is a deceptive terrain filled with deep canyons and volcanic pits that the soldiers call black holes. These are vertical shafts in the basalt that can be hundreds of feet deep, often hidden by thin layers of scrub brush or loose gravel. Beyond the base perimeter, the ground is a checkerboard of active minefields left over from decades of conflict. To walk off the paved path was to gamble with gravity and explosives. Ari watched Guy reach the final security fence that marked the edge of the military zone. Beyond that fence lay a narrow strip of no man's land, followed by the heavily fortified border with Syria. It was one of the most monitored stretches of land on the planet, covered by long-range cameras, seismic sensors, and elite trackers. Nothing was supposed to move out there without a dozen different systems recording its every vibration. Guy did not stop at the gate. He stepped onto the red dirt of the perimeter road and continued walking directly toward the Syrian line. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where the mines were buried, or perhaps someone who no longer cared. Ari felt a flicker of confusion, wondering if Guy had been assigned a solo patrol he hadn't heard about on the radio. The sun beat down on the basalt rocks until they radiated a heat that distorted the air into a series of liquid waves. Ari gripped the hot metal of the tower, railing his vision beginning to blur from the intensity of the light. The silence of the border was a physical weight pressing against his eardrums until his own pulse sounded like a drum. He thought to himself that a man could walk 10 minutes in this heat and simply evaporate into the shimmer. Guy was now 100 yards past the fence, a solitary speck of olive green against the vast gray-black plateau. He reached a small ridge of volcanic rock and stepped over it, his figure momentarily silhouetted against the blinding white sky. Then he descended the other side and vanished from Ari's line of sight. It was the last time any Israeli citizen would ever see Guy Hever. When Guy failed to show up for the evening roll call, the base went into a state of immediate lockdown. Commanders assumed he had fallen into a ravine or perhaps suffered a heat stroke during an unauthorized walk. A massive search operation was launched before the sun had even fully set. Paratroopers, elite trackers, and search dogs moved across the plateau in a sweeping grid. Helicopters equipped with the latest thermal imaging cameras hovered over the canyons searching for a heat signature in the cooling rocks. They scanned every black hole and every dry creek bed within a 5-mile radius of the base. They checked the minefields with remote sensors, looking for any sign of a fresh detonation or a disturbed patch of earth. They found absolutely nothing. The investigation became a geopolitical puzzle that spanned decades. There was no evidence that Guy had stepped on a mine, as no sensors had recorded an explosion and no blood was found. There was no sign that he had been abducted by a Syrian commando unit, which would have required crossing a fence line monitored by high-frequency cameras. His rifle, his keys, and his identification simply ceased to exist along with him. The Israeli Defense Forces conducted dozens of secret excavations in the Golan over the next 20 years. They drained local reservoirs and sent divers into the deepest volcanic pits. Each time a new piece of intelligence surfaced, the army returned to the basalt plateau with heavy machinery. But the ground remained as silent as the day Guy walked into the heat. A strange detail emerged years later when a German woman claimed she had been detained in a Syrian prison in Damascus. She insisted that she had seen a man matching Guy's description being interrogated by Syrian intelligence officers. This sparked a wave of hope that he had been captured alive and was being held as a political prisoner. The Israeli government investigated the claim for years, but the Syrian authorities denied any knowledge of the soldier. The twist in the vanishing of Guy Hever was the absolute failure of the world's most advanced surveillance. In a zone where a stray dog can trigger a military response in seconds, a 6-foot-tall man carrying a metal rifle walked through the heart of the sensors and left no record. The system didn't fail because of a technical glitch. It failed because Guy seemed to have bypassed the physical laws of the border itself. One theory suggested that Guy had planned his disappearance with professional precision, finding a blind spot in the cameras that only a local soldier would know. Another theory was much darker, suggesting that he had fallen into a hidden crevice so deep and narrow that even thermal cameras could not detect his body. In the volcanic geography of the Golan, the earth is full of hungry spaces. Guy Hever remains the only Israeli soldier to vanish on active duty without a single trace of his equipment or his weapon. His mother Rina has spent nearly 30 years traveling the world, meeting with diplomats and searching for any scrap of information. She still keeps his room exactly as it was on that August morning, waiting for a son who walked toward a line and never crossed back. The case is still officially listed as an active missing persons investigation. Periodic searches are still conducted in the Golan Heights whenever the brush is cleared by fire or the earth shifts after a winter storm. But as the decades pass, the basalt rocks only grow smoother under the sun. The plateau holds its secrets with a cold volcanic indifference. The watchtower where Ari stood still overlooks the same stretch of black stone and barbed wire. The heat shimmer still plays tricks on the eyes of the young soldiers who stand on guard duty today. They look out at the horizon, watching for a threat that might be coming toward them, never suspecting that the greatest danger is the silence of the ground beneath their feet. The border is a line drawn in the dirt, a promise of safety that depends on the world staying in its proper place. But sometimes, a person finds a way to walk through the cracks in the narrative. They leave behind a vacuum that no amount of technology can fill. Across the world, another group of elite travelers would find that the environment didn't need a border to become a trap. They were high in the mountains of Romania, moving through a landscape that looked like a postcard until the air itself turned into a weapon. The mountain didn't just hide them, it turned them into statues. February 1997, the Salvamont Rescue Station in the Retezat Mountains was a small stone building that smelled of kerosene and wet wool. Lucian was sitting on a wooden bench, tightening the thick laces of his leather boots. Outside, the peaks of the Romanian Carpathians rose like jagged teeth against a sky that was the color of a bruised plum. Lucian was 28 years old and had spent most of his life navigating the high-altitude basins of the Retezat National Park. He was a man of few words, a characteristic common among the mountain rescue teams who lived in the shadow of the granite massifs. His job was to maintain the trails and wait for the calls that inevitably came during the winter season. He moved with a slow, deliberate efficiency that saved energy for the climbs ahead. The Retezat was often called the land of the blue eyes because of the 80 glacial lakes that dotted its valleys. In the summer, it was a place of crystalline beauty and clear air. In the winter, it turned into a vertical fortress of ice and unpredictable weather. Lucian checked the battery on his radio and looked at the barometer on the wall. The needle was steady, but he knew the mountain was never truly at rest. A group of 6 climbers had arrived at the base camp a few days earlier. They were not amateurs looking for a weekend hike. They were some of the most experienced mountaineers in Romania, led by a guide who had climbed the highest peaks in the world. They were equipped with the latest cold weather gear and carried enough supplies for a week on the ridge. To Lucian, they were the kind of group that rarely needed help. The group had planned a routine winter route across the northern ridge, a path they had all traveled many times before. They moved with the confidence of people who understood the terrain perfectly. Their ordinary life was defined by the thin air and the rhythmic crunch of crampons on frozen snow. They communicated in short functional sentences and kept a steady pace as they climbed toward the summit. As they reached the highest point of their route, the sun was reflecting off the granite faces in a way that made the mountains appear to glow. They took a few minutes to admire the view of the valley below before preparing for the descent. They were less than 2 miles from their target shelter. In their minds, the hardest part of the journey was already behind them. The first strange detail appeared as they began their downward trek. The guide stopped and pointed toward the western horizon, where a thin white line was beginning to form. It didn't look like a storm front or a typical cloud bank. It looked like a solid wall of mist that was moving toward them at an impossible speed. The air around them suddenly went completely still, and the temperature dropped 5 degrees in less than a minute. Lucian was standing on the porch of the station when he felt the pressure change. The wind began to whistle through the pine trees with a sharp, metallic frequency that he had only heard a few times in his life. He saw the white wall roll over the distant peaks, erasing the granite from view in a matter of seconds. He walked back inside and grabbed his heavy parka, knowing that the mountain had just turned. The climbers on the ridge were caught in a phenomenon known locally as a whiteout storm. Within 2 minutes, their visibility was reduced to less than 3 feet. The wind was screaming with enough force to knock a grown man off his feet. The temperature plunged to minus 30 degrees Celsius, a level of cold that can freeze exposed skin in seconds. They were no longer descending a mountain, they were trapped in a blinding horizontal sea of ice. The guide realized they could not make it to the shelter in these conditions. He signaled for the group to huddle together against a large rock face to preserve their body heat. They tried to use their packs as a shield, but the wind was stripping the warmth from their layers faster than their bodies could produce it. They were in a race against a clock that was moving much faster than they were. Lucian and his rescue team set out the next morning as soon as the wind subsided. The sun was back, reflecting off a fresh layer of snow that made the landscape look pristine and peaceful. They followed the ridgeline, their eyes scanning the rocks for any sign of a tent or a discarded piece of gear. Lucian felt the biting cold through his gloves and adjusted his goggles. The granite peaks rose around him like silent judges, and the crust of the snow crunched under his boots with a dry, hollow sound. The wind had carved the drifts into sharp, frozen waves that looked like they could cut through stone. Lucian could feel the thin, freezing air burning the back of his throat with every breath he took. I am walking through a museum of ghosts, he thought. They found the first sign of the group near a sheltered hollow beneath a jagged overhang. There were no tracks leading away from the site, and the snow was undisturbed by any struggle. Lucian signaled to his partners, and they moved forward with their shovels held ready. He expected to find a collapsed tent or a pile of sleeping bags buried under a drift. The investigators began to reconstruct the final moments of the elite climbers. They found that the group had stayed together until the very end, following the guide's instructions to the letter. Each piece of evidence showed that they had done everything right according to their training. They had chosen the best possible location for a bivouac and had utilized their equipment to its maximum potential. The twist in the Retezat massacre was not how they died, but the way they were found. When Lucian cleared away the top layer of snow, he didn't find a huddle of bodies on the ground. He found the 6 climbers standing upright against the rock face in a perfect line. They were positioned one behind the other, their arms wrapped around the person in front of them in a formation known as a conga line. They had attempted to create a human shield, using the collective heat of their bodies to protect the person at the very front of the line. But the cold had been so absolute and the wind so high that they had frozen into place while still standing. They looked like a collection of statues carved from the mountain itself, their eyes still open and fixed on the horizon. The medical examiner later confirmed that they had all died of extreme hypothermia within an hour of the storm hitting the ridge. The speed of the event had been so great that their brains had likely entered a state of terminal burrowing. This is a final stage of freezing, where the victim feels a sudden paradoxical sensation of heat and tries to crawl into small, confined spaces to hide. Lucian helped carry the frozen figures down the mountain on sleds, a task that took 2 full days of grueling labor. He noticed that the clothing on the victims was still neatly zipped, and their gear was still in place. They had not panicked, and they had not given up. They had simply been outpaced by an environment that changed its rules in the middle of a sentence. The case was officially ruled a natural disaster caused by a localized weather event that didn't appear on any radar. In Romania, the Retezat massacre is still spoken of as a warning to even the most experienced travelers. It is a story about the limit of human skill and the moment when gear and knowledge are no longer enough to bridge the gap between life and death. The 6 climbers were buried in their hometowns, but their names are engraved on a small stone marker near the ridge where they were found. The trail remains a popular route for mountaineers, though most now move through the area with a new kind of silence. They look at the granite faces and the white clouds on the horizon with a cold, respectful focus. Lucian still works for the Salvamont station and still checks the barometer every evening before he goes to bed. He sometimes stands on the porch and looks toward the ridge, listening for the sound of the wind through the pines. He knows that the mountain didn't kill the group with a fall or an avalanche. It killed them with a single freezing breath. The Retezat Mountains stay white and silent for most of the year, holding on to the cold like a heavy secret. The lakes remain frozen under the ice, looking like blue eyes that never blink. The ground is solid and predictable until the moment it isn't. Just across the world, another man would step out of a car and find that the ground could vanish in a place where it never snows. May 1998. A white rental sedan was kicking up a thin trail of orange dust as it moved through the heart of the Namib National Park. A woman named Greta sat in the passenger seat, her hand resting on the dashboard to steady herself against the vibration of the gravel road. Beside her, her husband Hans-Ulrich von Bach gripped the steering wheel with the relaxed confidence of a man who had traveled the world. The Namib Desert is a place of absolute geological scale, a sea of red sand dunes that are among the highest on Earth. To Greta, the landscape looked like a frozen ocean, beautiful and indifferent to the humans passing through it. They were experienced travelers from Switzerland who had spent years exploring remote corners of the globe. This trip to Namibia was meant to be the crown jewel of their retirement adventures. The air inside the car was cool thanks to the air conditioning that hummed steadily against the midday heat. Hans-Ulrich was a 50-year-old businessman who approached every journey with the same meticulous planning he used in the boardroom. He had mapped their route, checked the fuel levels, and carried a set of expensive binoculars around his neck. He was a man who appreciated order and the clarity of a well-executed plan. They had spent the morning driving through the vast open plains, where the only signs of life were the occasional oryx or a distant ostrich. Greta enjoyed the silence between them, the comfortable quiet of a marriage that had lasted for decades. They were heading toward a specific scenic point that was famous for its view of the towering sand dunes. The road was a narrow ribbon of gray rock that seemed to lead directly into the shimmering heat haze. Hans-Ulrich checked his watch and noticed they were slightly ahead of schedule. He mentioned that he wanted to stop briefly to take a few photographs before the light changed too much. He was an amateur photographer who took pride in capturing the raw texture of the landscapes they visited. Greta nodded and began to look for a safe place to pull over along the shoulder of the road. They found a small flat area near a high ridge that overlooked a valley of smaller dunes. Hans-Ulrich brought the car to a smooth stop and left the engine running to keep the air conditioning active for Greta. He told her he would only be gone for 5 minutes, just long enough to walk over the ridge and get a clear shot of the horizon. He stepped out of the car, leaving the door slightly ajar. Greta watched him walk away through the side mirror. He was wearing light khaki clothing and a wide-brimmed hat to shield himself from the sun. He looked small and vulnerable against the backdrop of the red sand, but he moved with a steady, purposeful stride. He reached the crest of the ridge, paused for a moment to adjust his camera, and then disappeared over the other side. The desert silence began to press in on the car as soon as the door clicked shut. Greta picked up a book she had been reading and tried to focus on the pages, but she found herself checking the clock on the dashboard instead. 5 minutes passed, then 10. She looked out the window at the ridge, expecting to see her husband's hat appear above the line of the sand. The heat outside the car was radiating off the ground, invisible waves that made the distant dunes look like they were melting. Greta decided to honk the horn, a short, sharp burst of sound that was immediately swallowed by the vastness of the park. She waited another 5 minutes, and then stepped out of the vehicle herself. The heat hit her like a physical weight, making her skin sting and her eyes water. She walked a few yards toward the ridge and called out his name, but her voice felt thin and powerless in the dry air. She reached the top of the ridge where Hans-Ulrich had last been seen and looked down into the valley on the other side. The area was a maze of smaller dunes and dry creek beds, all of them looking identical in the harsh afternoon light. There was no sign of a man in khaki. Greta returned to the car and drove several miles to the nearest ranger station to report her husband missing. She felt a cold, rising panic that she struggled to keep under control as she spoke to the authorities. The rangers were professional and calm, assuring her that people often lost their bearings in the dunes and that they would find him before nightfall. They launched a search party immediately. By the next morning, the search had grown to include local police and elite bush trackers from the nearby villages. These were men who could read the history of the desert in a disturbed pebble or a broken blade of grass. They began at the point where the rental car had been parked and moved over the ridge. They found the clear, deep prints of Hans-Ulrich's boots in the soft sand. The trackers followed the prints into the valley, noting that the husband had initially walked in a straight line toward a large rock formation. He seemed to be moving with a specific destination in mind. But then the nature of the tracks began to change. The stride became shorter and more erratic, and the prints began to overlap in a way that suggested a sudden loss of direction. The investigation revealed that Hans-Ulrich had begun to walk in large, sweeping circles that eventually narrowed into smaller loops. This is a common phenomenon for people who are lost in an environment without landmarks. They believe they are walking in a straight line while their bodies naturally pull them to one side. He was walking miles of distance while staying within a small, deadly radius. Greta sat in the ranger station listening to the updates from the radio. She learned that the trackers had found a place where Hans-Ulrich had sat down for a period of time, perhaps to rest or to wait for the heat to subside. There were no signs of a struggle and no evidence of a predator. The desert was simply a psychological trap that was slowly draining his resolve and his energy. The search continued for several days, covering dozens of square miles of the Red Sand Sea. Helicopters flew low over the dunes, their observers looking for a flash of light from a camera lens or a signal from a mirror. They found nothing but the shifting shadows of the sand. The wind was beginning to pick up a light breeze that threatened to erase the tracks the searchers were relying on. Then the trackers reached a flat, hard-packed plain of desert pavement about 3 miles from the original ridge. They showed the investigators a set of prints that were still visible in a patch of soft silt. The tracks showed Hans-Ulrich walking at a steady pace, moving toward the center of the open plain. He was not running, and he did not appear to be stumbling. The twist in the disappearance of the Swiss wanderer was the absolute finality of the trail. The trackers followed the footprints to the middle of the flat plain where the silt ended and the hard rock began. The prints did not turn around, and they did not continue onto the harder ground. They simply stopped in a single spot, as if the man had been lifted directly into the sky. The searchers spent hours scouring the area for any sign of a body or a discarded piece of equipment. They looked for hidden crevices or small caves where a man might crawl to escape the sun. They checked the surrounding dunes for any fresh burials or signs of scavenger activity. There was nothing but the vast, empty horizon and the sound of the wind. A week later, a park ranger was patrolling a rocky outcrop several miles away from the last known tracks. He noticed a flash of light reflecting off a high, flat rock. He climbed up and found a pair of expensive binoculars sitting perfectly level on the stone. They were pointing toward the horizon where the rental car had been parked, but they were miles away from where anyone believed Hans-Ulrich could have traveled. The binoculars were clean and undamaged, looking as if they had been placed there by a man who intended to return for them in a few seconds. There were no footprints around the rock, and no other items were found nearby. It was as if the binoculars had appeared there by themselves, a final silent marker of a man who was no longer in the desert. Hans-Ulrich von Bach was never found. Despite reward offers from his family and private investigations funded by his estate, no trace of his body or his camera has ever surfaced. He was eventually declared dead in absentia by the Swiss government. The case remains one of the most unsettling mysteries in the history of the Namibian national parks. Greta returned to Switzerland alone, carrying only the memories of a trip that had ended in a vacuum. She still thinks about the 5 minutes she waited in the car and the sound of the engine humming in the silence. She wonders if her husband saw something over the ridge that was not a landscape but a doorway into something else. The Namib Desert continues to shift its red dunes every day, burying the past and revealing new shapes in the sand. The heat still creates mirages that lure the eyes toward things that are not there. The silence of the plains is still a weight that can crush the mind of a traveler who stays too long. The desert does not leave crumbs, and it does not offer explanations. The binoculars were kept in an evidence locker for years before being returned to the family. They are a physical reminder of the day the earth moved and the tracks stopped. Some places are not meant to be captured in a photograph. They are only meant to be seen once before the light fades and the door closes. The red sand of Namibia holds its secrets as tightly as the concrete of a storage unit in the American South. Both are containers that were never meant to be opened, designed to keep the truth from the light. But sometimes a stranger with a heavy hammer finds the strength to break the seal and look inside. August 1997, Greer, South Carolina. Bill slid the steel jaws of his bolt cutters over a rusted padlock and squeezed until the metal snapped. He was a professional buyer of abandoned lives, a man who frequented storage auctions to bid on the forgotten contents of lockers. The air in the facility was thick and stagnant, smelling of hot asphalt and sun-baked tin. He pulled the rolling door upward, listening to the rattling protest of the metal tracks. A wall of heat pushed out from the darkness of Unit 84, carrying the scent of dust and old paper. Bill stepped inside with a flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom to reveal a cluttered graveyard of household goods. He saw a stained mattress, stacks of yellowing newspapers, and a collection of mismatched wooden chairs. Everything was covered in a fine layer of gray grit that had settled over years of neglect. He moved deeper into the unit, careful not to trip over a tangled pile of rusted garden tools. Most of what he saw was typical of a locker that had been ignored by its owner. People often move their lives into these small tin boxes during a transition and then simply stop paying the monthly rent. Bill made his living by finding the small treasures buried under the mundane wreckage of those transitions. In the very back corner of the unit, hidden behind a stack of moth-eaten blankets, sat a large blue industrial barrel. It was a heavy-duty plastic container, the kind used for transporting chemicals or bulk food products. Bill noticed a faint cloying scent as he approached it, something that smelled like a mixture of old laundry detergent and spoiled fruit. He assumed the barrel contained cleaning supplies that had leaked in the summer heat. Bill reached down to tilt the barrel so he could roll it toward the door where the light was better. He gripped the plastic rim and pulled, expecting the container to move with the weight of a few gallons of liquid. Instead, the barrel remained perfectly still, as if it were a solid pillar of iron bolted to the concrete floor. He adjusted his stance and pulled with his full strength, but the blue plastic did not budge. He shined his flashlight on the top of the barrel and saw that it was not just closed with a standard lid. A thick, uneven layer of gray concrete had been poured over the top, sealing the container completely. The concrete was jagged and dusty, looking like it had been applied in a hurry by someone who was not a professional mason. Bill tapped the side of the barrel with his knuckles and heard a dull, dead sound. The storage unit was a narrow, windowless oven that had been soaking up the 90-degree South Carolina sun all afternoon. Bill could feel the heat radiating from the corrugated metal walls, making the air feel like it was vibrating around his head. His shirt was stuck to his spine with sweat, and his palms were slick as he gripped the heavy sledgehammer he had fetched from his truck. He thought to himself that whatever was buried under that stone was heavy enough to be valuable, or heavy enough to be a problem. He raised the hammer over his right shoulder and brought it down with a grunting exhale. The impact sent a shockwave through his arms that made his teeth rattle, but the concrete only showed a tiny white chip. He swung again and again, his breath coming in ragged hitches as the dust from the stone filled his lungs. On the fifth strike, a large piece of the gray crust finally cracked away, revealing a dark, matted texture beneath the surface. The smell that escaped from the breach was sudden and overwhelming, a thick wave of decay that seemed to coat the back of his throat. Bill dropped the sledgehammer and scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the grit-covered floor. He didn't need to look any closer to understand that the texture he had seen was not a treasure. He walked out of the unit into the bright, blinding sunlight and waited for the Greer police to arrive. Detective Mike Miller arrived at the scene 30 minutes later, finding the facility manager and the auction buyer standing far back from Unit 84. He put on a pair of latex gloves and entered the locker, noting the professional way the barrel had been hidden in the rear corner. He looked at the cracked concrete and saw a fragment of a floral patterned dress embedded in the gray stone. It was a chilling sight that transformed a routine civil matter into a homicide investigation. The forensic team spent hours carefully chipping away the rest of the concrete sarcophagus to recover the remains. They found a woman who had been placed in the barrel in a fetal position, her body preserved remarkably well by the airtight seal of the stone. She appeared to have been in her early 30s at the time of her death. Miller checked the local missing persons records, looking for anyone who had vanished in the early 1990s. The trail led directly to a name that had been cold for 5 years. Jeannie Gwen Hydrick had disappeared from her home in Florida in 1992. At the time, her husband, Danny Hydrick, had told her family and the police a very convincing story. He claimed that Gwen had been struggling with her life and had decided to join a secretive religious cult in the mountains. Danny described Gwen as a woman who had always been searching for something more, a person interested in alternative spirituality and hidden truths. He told her mother that Gwen had found a group that offered her the enlightenment she had been seeking. He insisted that she had explicitly stated she wanted no further contact with her past life or her children. It was a narrative that played on Gwen's real interests to explain her absence. To support his claim, Danny began to show the family letters that he said were from Gwen. They were written on plain stationery and filled with the kind of New Age vocabulary that she often used in her journals. The notes spoke of her peace of mind and her need for isolation to complete her spiritual journey. The family, though heartbroken, eventually accepted the letters as a sign that Gwen was at least alive and safe. Detective Miller tracked down the original rental agreement for the storage unit in Greer. He He found that it had been opened in late 1992, just weeks after Gwen was reported missing. The name on the contract was Danny Hydrick. He had used a local address and had paid the monthly rent in cash for 5 consecutive years without ever missing a single deadline. Miller realized that while the family was mourning a woman they thought had abandoned them, Gwen had been sitting in a tin box just a few miles away. Danny had killed her during an argument and then spent days manufacturing a new identity for her. He used her own personality as a weapon, crafting a lie that would keep her family from looking too closely at the woods or the water. He had turned his wife into a ghost. The investigation moved to the house in Florida where the couple had lived. Miller interviewed neighbors who remembered Danny as a quiet, almost invisible man who seemed to handle his wife's departure with a strange level of calm. They recalled seeing him moving several bags of heavy concrete into his garage around the time Gwen vanished. He had told them he was working on a small home improvement project for the patio. Miller traveled to Georgia to arrest Danny, who was now living a new life with a different partner. When the detectives showed him the photographs of the blue barrel and the floral dress, the mask of the grieving husband finally began to slip. Danny did not cry or act surprised. He simply looked at the images with a cold, detached curiosity, as if he were reviewing a business contract that had finally expired. The forensic analysis of the letters Danny had provided to the family revealed the depth of his deception. Handwriting experts determined that Danny had spent weeks practicing Gwen's signature and her specific style of cursive. He had even used her old diaries to find phrases and themes that would make the forgeries seem authentic. He had not just hidden her body, he had attempted to overwrite her soul. During the trial, the prosecution presented the blue barrel as the ultimate evidence of premeditation and cruelty. They argued that Danny had not killed Gwen in a fit of sudden passion, but had systematically erased her from existence. He had forced her children to grow up believing their mother didn't love them enough to stay. He had watched them cry for years while he kept the key to her concrete grave in his pocket. The defense tried to argue that Danny had panicked after an accidental death, but the jury was not moved. The effort required to mix and pour concrete into an industrial barrel spoke of a man who was focused on one thing above all else. He wanted a secret that he could control, a version of his wife that would never talk back and never leave the corner of Unit 84. He was a man who preferred a block of stone to a human life. Danny Hydrick was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. The family finally received the truth they had been denied for half a decade, though it was a truth that carried a heavy price. They had to reconcile the mother they thought they knew with the woman who had been discarded in a plastic drum. The letters that had once brought them comfort were now nothing more than the artifacts of a killer's imagination. Gwen was finally given a proper burial in a cemetery near her childhood home, far away from the storage facility and the concrete. Her children, now young adults, were able to reclaim the memory of a mother who had never actually left them. They realized that the story of the cult was a fiction, a dark fairy tale told by a man who was afraid of the light. The block of stone was gone, and Gwen was no longer a secret. The storage facility in Greer continued to operate with Unit 84, eventually being rented out to a new tenant. The blue barrel was taken away by a hazardous waste crew and destroyed. There is no lingering scent of concrete or decay in the alleyway now. The facility looks exactly like 1,000 other places where people keep the things they don't have room for in their daily lives. The silence of a storage locker is a specific kind of quiet, a domestic emptiness that usually holds nothing more than holiday decorations or old clothes. But sometimes that silence is a mask for a much larger weight. It is a place where the past is kept on a monthly payment plan. Just a few thousand miles away, another man would find himself in a much larger container that was not made by human hands. He would be trapped in a space where the walls were made of mud and the ceiling was a mountain of concrete. Like Gwen, he would be pinned in a dark void, waiting for someone to find him. But unlike the woman in the barrel, he would have to listen to the silence of his wife while he waited for 65 hours for the light to return. April 28, 1995. The Paparoa National Park on the west coast of New Zealand was a landscape of rugged limestone cliffs and dense prehistoric rainforest. A 19-year-old student named Stacy was hiking along a narrow gravel trail, her boots kicking up small puffs of gray dust. She was part of a group of 17 outdoor recreation students from the Tai Putini Polytechnic. The air was crisp and carried the damp, earthy scent of wet ferns and ancient stone. Stacy was surrounded by her classmates, a group of young men and women who lived for the challenge of the wilderness. They were on a field trip to study the unique geology of the Punakaiki region, a place where the earth was honeycombed with deep caves and narrow chasms. The group was heading toward a specific overlook, known as Cave Creek. It was a remote spot where a small river emerged from an underground cavern and plunged into a limestone canyon. To get the best view, the Department of Conservation had built a wooden viewing platform that hung directly over the edge of the cliff. It was a popular destination for hikers who wanted to see the raw power of the water from above. Stacy enjoyed the physical effort of the hike, the way her lungs burned with the steady incline of the trail. She was wearing a heavy backpack and sturdy hiking boots, looking every bit the experienced mountain guide she hoped to become. Her ordinary life was defined by topographic maps, weather patterns, and the predictable mechanics of ropes and carabiners. She felt a deep sense of security in the structured world of outdoor education. The students reached the edge of the canyon and saw the wooden platform stretching out over the void. It was a simple structure made of treated timber with a high railing and a floor of thick planks. To Stacy, it looked like a natural extension of the trail, a safe harbor where they could rest and take photographs. The group began to cluster together on the wood, laughing and shouting over the roar of the water below. There were 17 students and one park ranger standing on the platform at the same time. They were jostling for position, trying to get the best angle for a group photo that would capture their successful trek. Stacy moved toward the front of the railing, feeling the slight vibration of the wood under her feet as her classmates moved around her. It was a moment of pure youthful celebration in a beautiful place. The first strange detail appeared when the vibration didn't stop once everyone had found their place. Stacy felt a subtle rhythmic swaying that seemed to originate from the very base of the structure. It wasn't the movement of a wooden floor, but the slow, heavy tilt of an entire building. She looked at the student standing next to her and noticed that the horizon of the trees was slowly rising. The wood beneath Stacy's boots gave a low, guttural groan that vibrated through the soles of her shoes. She felt the railing press harder against her palms as the floor shifted another few degrees toward the chasm. The sound of the rushing water below seemed to grow louder as the air around her suddenly felt thin and unstable. She thought to herself that the mountain was finally pushing them off. A sharp, explosive crack echoed through the canyon, sounding like a gunshot fired from directly beneath the floorboards. The platform detached from the limestone cliff in a single, violent motion. There was no time for anyone to scream or reach for a handhold. The structure simply rolled forward and plummeted 30 meters into the rocky bed of Cave Creek. Stacy felt the terrifying sensation of total weightlessness as she fell through the air. The wooden floor disintegrated around her, turning into a lethal hail of splintering beams and jagged planks. She hit the shallow water and the limestone boulders with a force that knocked the world into a black, silent void. She lay in the freezing creek, surrounded by the wreckage of the platform and the bodies of her friends. The rescue operation was a nightmare of logistics and inaccessible terrain. The canyon was so narrow and deep that helicopters could not land, requiring medics to be winched down on long cables. They found a scene of total devastation in the shadows of the cliffs. 14 people had been killed instantly by the fall or the impact of the falling timber, leaving only 4 survivors. The investigation that followed revealed a litany of systemic errors that were far more disturbing than the accident itself. Forensic engineers examined the remains of the platform and found that it had been built by Department of Conservation staff who had no formal engineering qualifications. The structure had been assembled without a building permit and had never been inspected by a certified professional. The most shocking detail was the way the platform had been attached to the cliff face. Instead of using heavy-duty steel bolts anchored deep into the limestone, the builders had used small galvanized nails. The entire structure had been held in place by little more than its own weight and the friction of the wood against the rock. It was a trap that had been waiting for the 17th person to step on it. The legal aftermath turned into a national scandal that led to a royal commission of inquiry. The investigators discovered that the Department of Conservation was suffering from severe budget cuts and a culture of cutting corners to meet deadlines. The platform at Cave Creek was not an isolated mistake, but the result of a system that prioritized scenic views over human safety. The Minister of Conservation was forced to resign under intense public pressure, and the department underwent a total restructuring. New Zealand's building codes were tightened, and every public structure in a national park was subjected to a rigorous safety audit. But for the families of the 14 students, the changes to the law were small comfort for the loss of their children. Stacy and the other 3 survivors spent months in the hospital recovering from broken bones and internal injuries. They had to live with the memory of the 2 seconds when the world fell out from under them. They were the witnesses to a tragedy that was born not in the mountains, but in a government office miles away from the creek. The site of the accident was eventually cleared and a memorial was built on the trail leading to the overlook. It is a quiet place of stone and bronze, listing the names of those who died on that afternoon in April. The Department of Conservation now maintains the area with a level of scrutiny that was absent in 1995. The trails are wider, and the overlook is now a fenced area on solid ground. The sound of Cave Creek still echoes through the canyon, a constant reminder of the power of the water and the fragility of the stone. The limestone cliffs remain as beautiful and indifferent as they were before the platform was built. The forest has grown back over the scars left by the fallen timber, erasing the physical evidence of the disaster. The tragedy of Cave Creek remains a haunting lesson in the cost of quiet negligence. It is a story about the moment when the things we trust to hold us up simply let go. When the bolts are missing and the plans are ignored, the earth does not offer a second chance. The mountain only watches as the laws of physics take their course. The wooden planks are gone and the nails have rusted into the dirt. The only thing left is the silence that follows the roar of the water. Some places are meant to be seen from a distance, and some lines are never meant to be crossed. The sound of the water at Cave Creek eventually fades into the background of the park, but the weight of those missing bolts remains heavy in the mind. We like to believe that the world is a series of solid surfaces and reliable structures built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. But if these 11 stories have taught us anything, it is that the floor beneath your feet is often held together by nothing more than gravity and the hope that you will not look too closely at the seams. We move through our lives with a deep, unearned trust in the mundane mechanics of the everyday world. We trust the water mains under our houses, the padlocks on our storage units, and the gravel roads that lead into the wilderness. We assume that as long as we follow the rules and stay on the path, the world will remain predictable and kind. But the stories we have shared today suggest that the path is much thinner than we care to admit, and the rules can change in the middle of a heartbeat. The tragedy in Taiwan showed us that even the light of 1,000 flashbulbs can be a form of darkness, turning a private rescue into a public execution. It was a reminder that sometimes the very people who claim to be watching over us are the ones who make it impossible to see the danger. When the eyes of the world are fixed on a single point, they can create a shadow so deep that a young girl can disappear inside of it. Even when the cameras are rolling and the whole nation is holding its breath. In the Lake District, we saw that the water does not forget what it has been asked to hide, even after 21 years of silence. The blue dress and the nautical knots were artifacts of a truth that was waiting for the right moment to float to the surface. It is a chilling thought that a man can look his children in the eye every morning while knowing exactly what lies beneath the surface of the lake where they go to play. Some secrets are not buried, they are simply held in a state of deep, freezing suspension. The concrete barrel in South Carolina and the Burberry coat in Shibuya tell a similar story about the masks we wear to survive our own lives. We often believe that we know the people closest to us, yet we rarely see the notebook they keep in their purse or the key they hide in their pocket. We are all researchers of our own secret economies, balancing the prestige of our day jobs against the dark impulses we follow once the sun goes down. The concrete is just a physical manifestation of the lies we tell to keep the truth from breathing. When we look at the mountains of Wyoming or the basalt plains of the Golan Heights, we are reminded that the earth itself is a predator with a very long memory. It does not matter if you are a world-class runner or a soldier with an assault rifle. The ground can open up and swallow you without leaving a single footprint. We build our high-tech sensors and our military towers to feel secure, but a volcanic crevice or a red sand dune does not care about our technology. It only knows the weight of what it takes. The miracle of the man in Thredbo and the massacre in the Retezat are two sides of the same alpine coin, showing us that survival is often a matter of seconds and inches. One man lives for 65 hours because of a small void in the concrete, while 6 elite climbers freeze to death in the time it takes to draw a single breath. There is no moral to the wind or the mud. There is only the physical reality of the temperature and the speed of the shift. The mountain does not choose its victims. It only waits for them to arrive. The desert in Namibia and the caves in Thailand teach us about the psychological traps that the environment can set for the unwary. A pocket of invisible gas or a circular set of tracks in the sand are mechanisms of disorientation that turn our own instincts against us. We want to save our friends and we want to find our way home, but the more we move, the deeper we sink into the trap. It is a quiet, rhythmic form of horror that happens in the absolute silence of a place where no one is coming to help you. If there is a common thread that connects these 11 disparate tragedies, it is the late realization that the world is not as solid as it appears. We are all standing on a platform that is being held together by nails that might be rusted or bolts that might be missing entirely. We are all living in a story that we think we understand right up until the moment the floor tilts and the light goes out. The danger is not usually the monster in the woods. It is the structural failure of the ordinary world we have built around ourselves. I hope these accounts serve as a reminder to look a little closer at the things you take for granted every day. Check the locks on your doors and the bolts on the structures you trust with your life. Understand that the silence of a forest or the shimmer of a desert can be a warning if you know how to listen for it. We tell these stories not to create fear, but to honor the people who were caught in the gaps between the narrative and the reality. Their names are the only thing the earth was forced to give back. If you have found value in these stories and appreciate this kind of storytelling, I invite you to subscribe to the channel and join our community. Your support allows us to continue digging into these cold cases and sharing the lessons they leave behind in the silty water and the red sand. We are always looking for the truth that stays hidden in the shadows, and we are grateful to have you along for the journey. It is a heavy world, but it is easier to navigate when we are watching out for each other. As you go about your evening, take a moment to listen to the sounds of your own home and the way the air moves through the hallways. We like to think that we are safe as long as the lights are on and the door is locked. But remember that every person in these stories felt the exact same way just a few minutes before the first strange detail appeared. The truth is usually sitting right in front of us, waiting for the one moment when we finally decide to notice it. The night is long, and the world is full of places that the map does not fully explain. There are still barrels that have not been opened, and lakes that have not been searched. There are still soldiers walking toward borders and runners heading into the pines. We will be here to tell those stories when they finally come to light, but for now, it is time to let the silence return. Thank you for spending this time with me, and for listening to the echoes of those who are no longer here to speak for themselves. Take care of the people you love, and do not assume that tomorrow will look exactly like today. The platform is always under pressure, and the wind is always beginning to shift on the western horizon. Look at the people around you and see them for who they really are, not just the mask they wear to the office. The only thing that is truly solid in this world is the connection we have to each other before the floor finally gives way. Keep your eyes open and your heart grounded in the present moment. I will leave you with one final image of the binoculars sitting on that red rock in the Namibian desert. They were pointing toward a home that was only a few miles away, yet they were as distant as the stars. Sometimes the answer is exactly where you left it, and the only thing missing is the person who was supposed to pick it up. The desert didn't move them. It only waited for the person to stop looking through the lens. Good night, and stay safe out there in the dark.